Hello, I'm Rich Finelli and welcome to the last section of this video course, Wrapping Up. As we're at the end of this course, I wanted to walk you through some possible next steps in your web development learning progression, as well as go through some links and resources for more information on everything we learned up through this point. In this video, we'll talk about the next steps. The first thing is that you really need to check out a CSS preprocessor like Sass or Less. Both are very similar and do mainly the same things. CSS preprocessors are powerful tools that allow you to write CSS more easily using features like nesting, includes, variables, and mix-ins. I've used both Less and Sass, and I've been using Sass for a while now. And when I started to create the course materials for mastering CSS, I had almost forgotten what it was like to write CSS without Sass. Needless to say, it gets much easier using a preprocessor like Sass, and it keeps your CSS so much more organized and clean. So I highly recommend it. One simple yet powerful feature of Sass are the variables. You can see I have variables set up for colors. So I have a variable called blue, which is the brand color for blue I've been using throughout the site. And the same thing goes for red. Now, anywhere when I need to put the hard to remember hex value of 0072AE, I can now just type in $blue, and Sass magically takes care of it. An even better use of variables is for fonts, and that's where I think it really gets powerful. Because with fonts, you usually put in, font family, and then you put in a stack of fonts. So you have to start typing in quotes. And with web fonts, these two fonts, Maven Pro and Droid Serif, are pretty, they're not too challenging to type in. But a lot of times, font services like Typekit, they give you these very long, kind of almost, a little bit complicated names for the fonts. So plugging all of that information into a variable, very simple one like Maven or Droid, that makes it really easy to use those very quickly anytime you need to. So you can see that, for my font family, for my call to action button, $Maven, and that's going to compile into, really for the font family, this whole string, Droid Serif, and then I have the variable for serif, which is Times New Roman, Georgia, and serif. So if we were to look at that on the site for the call to action button and inspect that, we can see first, the background color of $blue did compile into 0072AE, and the font family is getting compiled into Maven Pro, Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif. Now there's an even better feature in Sass called mix-ins. Basically, they're a method for abstracting out repetition. For instance, it's a drag typing in vendor prefixes for CSS3. But I can declare a mix-in using the @mixin keyword and then create a template chock full of vendor prefixes. So I'm saying, okay, I've declared a mixin called transition, and then inside of that, I have my transition property with these values, and I have that repeated 3 more times for the different vendor prefixed versions and the non-prefixed version. And then what I'm saying is, okay, well, this has different parameters, property, duration, timing function, each with a default value that can be overwritten later. But the default values are, okay, we're going to transition all properties for 0.25 seconds using the timing function of ease. So now what that allows me to do is, if I want to use a transition, I can just include @include transition. And what that'll compile into is, you can see I have WebKit transition, Moz transition, Opera transition, and then transition. Now I want to kind of draw our attention up here because I noticed this while I was preparing for this video is, one of the things I could do with this button is I could replace this with @include transition, and that's perfect. Now the problem is this transform, I never even created the vendor prefixed versions because when we were in development mode and development thinking, we were just trying to kind of make it work and make it look right, and we forgot to do that. But if we were using a mix-in for scale, we would have never forgot because the mix-in would have included all the vendor prefixes with just one line of code. So right there, That's a benefit we would have seen if we were using Sass. Beyond variables and mixins, there's also nesting, which on the surface may not seem too powerful, but it's extremely convenient. Instead of writing out descendant selectors, you can nest selectors inside of each other. So you can see I've actually nested the focus and hover selector inside of dot button. As a rule of thumb, don't nest if you don't have to, as each time you nest, the selector gets more specific and weighs more. The trick to modular CSS is keeping your selectors lightweight. I also mentioned in the video 7.2 on font kits that Sass allows you to create partial files for different parts of your CSS and import them into your main Sass file. So up at the top of our Sass file, I have a couple imports. Sass will compile all partial Sass files into one main CSS file. So I've got my CSS broken down into smaller chunks. You can see I have icons, mixins, modal, modular, reset, variables, and then my main style.scss file. And they all compile down into style.css. And that's kind of made possible, by using these imports. The best part about having these multiple organized files is that, again, it compiles down into one file. So that means just one HTTP request instead of multiple. So that's a performance gain right there. So, those are just a couple of the very nice features of a preprocessor, specifically Sass, but Sass or less are definitely the next logical steps at this point. Sass is fairly easy to set up. It requires you to install Ruby and use something to compile it. The Sass you write needs to go through a compiler to turn it into regular old CSS, as the browsers wouldn't understand the Sass code. For compiling, you can use your command line to watch for changes to the Sass file, or you can use a GUI like CodeKit, which is what I like to use. I've used both and I prefer CodeKit over the command line because with CodeKit I can set up the project once and CodeKit watches that project for changes to the Sass file forever. To learn more about Sass, there's a good video course by Brock Nunn in the Packed library. Also, a very, very good book is Sass for Web Designers by Dan Cederholm, which did a really great job of explaining Sass in simple terms, and it's a very quick read. Another logical step for front-end developers is to learn JavaScript if you haven't done so already. With CSS, we can add interactivity through hover and focus states, but we can't do anything on click or swipe or anything like that. Enter JavaScript and jQuery. I recommend you learn the basics of JavaScript, but if you want to get a springboard into it, it's also very quick to start out by learning jQuery. So let's say we want to do something like display a modal when we click the Learn More link. So we have a modal that shows, and when I click on close, the modal fades away. So we kind of have it, really we have an animation there. We have a fade in and a fade out. So with jQuery, this is relatively easy. The idea is to create the modal in HTML and CSS as if it's always there. Here, if we look at the index.html, I basically created the modal and I put that HTML at the very bottom of the HTML file. And then I have a Sass partial file called modal.scss, which basically just styles the modal to make it look and be positioned where it's supposed to be. It's also set to display none, so by default, it's not present. It's like our drop-down menu. By default, it's hidden. So what we'll do is we'll go over to our scripts file, and we have a function to open the modal, which basically says, okay, when I click on the link with a class of Learn More, when I click on the Learn More link, I'm going to fade in the element with a class of modal Learn More. And if we go back to our HTML, we'll see that that's the class we have on our modal div, modal Learn More. So, that's very, very readable, a very small amount of JavaScript. So the same thing goes if we want to tell the modal once it's open, when we click on the Learn More link, we want to also close it when we click on the Close link. So we have a bit of JavaScript to do that. And this is really jQuery. So we're basically saying when you click on Close Modal, we're going to have the modal learn more fade out. So jQuery handles the animation of fading it in and fading out through predefined methods that they have created. And selecting the div that we want to fade out and selecting the item or the element that we want to click on is very, very easy in jQuery. To learn more about jQuery, I recommend checking out the jQuery books in the packed library, particularly jQuery for Designers. Also, I recommend the jQuery course inside of csstricks.com/lodge, which does a really good job of explaining how to start using jQuery for those with no JavaScript background. Sass and jQuery are the logical next steps going forward, as Sass takes CSS authoring to the next level, and jQuery will give you the ability to add functionality and deeper interaction to your website. Not to mention, it will round you out as a developer.